She walked into that house carrying nothing but her father's survey papers and whatever was left of her dignity, sent there to be chosen by a man she had never met, for a life she had never wanted. The charming son looked at her the way men look at something they've already decided they don't want. But the silent man standing in the corner of that room looked at her differently. He looked at her like she was the only true thing in a room full of performance. If you've ever been underestimated by the wrong people, stay until the end. Subscribe and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from. We want to know how far Clara's story has traveled. The morning Clara Ashworth arrived at Hargrove County felt like the sky itself had decided to weigh down on her shoulders. July in Virginia was never gentle. It pressed heat into the earth and pulled sweat from the back of every working neck from sunup to past supper. But the heat that sat on Clara's chest as the wagon rolled through the main road of Hargrove was not the kind that came from the sun. It was the kind that came from knowing exactly what waited at the end of the road. She had the letter memorized by now, every line, every word her father's hand had pressed into the paper with the certainty of a man who believed he was doing something noble. My dear Clara, Mr. Holloway has agreed to receive you. His son Edmund is a fine young man of good reputation and reasonable fortune. This arrangement will secure your future in a way I cannot. You will go to Hargrove County, and you will conduct yourself with dignity. This is not a punishment. This is provision. Provision. She turned the word over in her mind, the way a stone gets turned in a river smoothed down, made smaller, worn of any edge that might catch the light. Her father was not a cruel man. She had told herself that every mile from Richmond. He was a man who had outlived his wife, outlived his savings, and outlived his belief that things might get better on their own. William Ashworth had been a surveyor once, a good one with steady hands and a mind that could read the land the way other men risk scripture. But the years had taken the steadiness from his hands and the fire from his eyes. And when Cornelius Holloway came to him with the proposal, her father had seen only the mercy of it. Clara had seen something else entirely. She had seen the way Cornelius Holloway's eyes moved over her in the parlor, not with appreciation, not even with appraisal, but with the flat assessment of a man looking at livestock. She had seen the way he smiled at her father, all teeth and no warmth, and she had known in the marrow of her bones that whatever this arrangement was, it had nothing to do with her future and everything to do with someone else's plan. But she had packed her trunk. She had kissed her father's lined cheek. And she had climbed into the wagon with her leather notebook pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. Because a woman of 24 in Virginia, in the year 1816, did not have the luxury of refusing provision. What she had was her mind and her father's survey notes, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that she would not be diminished no matter what Hargrove County thought of her. The wagon stopped in front of Holloway Hall at 10:15 in the morning. It was a fine house. She could see that from the drive. Wide white columns, a lawn that spoke of money carefully spent, 3 horses in the paddock that cost more than her father's house in Richmond. Clara took in none of it with envy. She took it in the way she took in everything, measuring, noting, filing it away. The door opened before she reached the steps. Cornelius Holloway stood in the frame like a man who had rehearsed the gesture. He was perhaps 60, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had been handsome once, and now wore its former handsomeness like a coat that no longer quite fit. Miss extended his hand. "Welcome to Hargrove, Mr. Holloway." She took his hand briefly. "Thank you for the hospitality." He led her inside, and it was immediately clear that the hospitality was performance. A maid appeared and disappeared. A parlor was offered. Tea was brought with the speed of a household that had been warned to look impressive. Edmund Holloway appeared 20 minutes later. She had braced herself for something. She hadn't been certain what. But Edmund walked into that parlor like a man who had never once considered that the world might not arrange itself according to his preferences. and Clara felt the cold weight of understanding settle over her. He was handsome. That was the first thing. The kind of handsome that had been told to him so many times it had become a fact he carried without effort. Like height or eye color, he was perhaps 28. Dark-haired, well-dressed. He smiled at her with the smile of a man doing someone a favor. Miss Ashworth. He looked her over quickly, but she caught it. Father said you'd be arriving this morning. I have, she said. He waited for something more. She did not offer it. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, and then he settled back into the smile. I trust the journey wasn't too hard on you. I manage well enough, she said. Cornelius Holloway laughed from his chair, a short, performative sound. She's practical, Edmund, I told you. Edmund's smile didn't quite reach his eyes. So I see. She was shown to a room, small but clean. A window that looked out over the east field. Clara set her trunk at the foot of the bed and sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed her hands flat on her knees and breathed. She was thinking about her father's letter again. This is provision. She looked at the east field through the window. Something about it caught her eye, not the prettiness of it, but the pattern of it. The furrows ran at an angle she didn't recognize. The drainage channels, from what she could see, were positioned in a way that didn't account for the slope of the land. She had looked at enough of her father's survey maps over the years to know that the east field, positioned as it was against the low ridge, would hold water badly after heavy rains. She pulled out her leather notebook and made a small notation. Old habits. The first supper at Holloway Hall told her everything she needed to know about her situation. They were not alone. Cornelius had invited 3 neighboring families, the Merritt, the Caldwells, and a family called Whitmore, represented at the table by 2 men, an older gentleman named George Whitmore and his younger brother. The younger brother arrived last. He walked in without apology for the lateness, without performance of any kind. He was perhaps 34 or 35 taller than Edmund, broader through the shoulders, with the kind of quietness about him that didn't read as shyness, but as a man who had decided long ago that most conversation wasn't worth his breath. His name, she learned, was James Whitmore. He took his seat at the far end of the table. He looked at her once, a direct, unhurried look that took her in, without the inventory feel of Edmund's glance, and then he looked away and began to eat. She found him easier to sit near than anyone else in the room. The supper conversation had the shape of all conversations in houses like this one, circling around land values, harvest projections, the business of neighboring estates, and the careful social theater of who knew whom and who stood where in the invisible architecture of Hargrove County. Clara ate quietly and listened and filed everything away in the notebook of her mind. Edmund, across the table, spoke often. He had opinions on everything and delivered them with the confidence of a man accustomed to being agreed with. His voice was pleasant. His points were sometimes sharp. He was, she supposed, what most women in her position would have called a satisfactory prospect. She could not make herself feel satisfied. Miss Ashworth. It was Cornelia Merritt, wife of the Merritt family's eldest son, addressing her with the particular brightness of a woman who has identified a novelty. Your father is a surveyor, I understand. He was, Clara said. He is retired now. How interesting. Mrs. Merritt's tone made clear she found it the opposite of interesting. And you have any particular accomplishments? The table quieted by the degree that was almost musical. Edmund glanced at his father. His father lifted his wineglass. Clara met Mrs. Merritt's eyes without blinking. I read land surveys, she said. I can identify drainage failures, soil composition issues, and irrigation miscalculations. I speak French reasonably well. I play pianoforte poorly but earnestly. There was a beat of silence. Then Charles Caldwell, a broad man of 40 with the look of someone who thought himself funnier than he was, laughed. Drainage failures. He looked around the table for allies. A woman who reads drainage failures. Edmund, you've imported yourself quite the curiosity. Edmund smiled. It was not the smile of a man coming to her defense. "Quite so," he said. Clara placed her fork carefully on the edge of her plate. From the far end of the table, James Whitmore said nothing. But she saw his jaw tighten. She saw the way his hand stilled around his glass. It was a small thing, the kind of thing most people wouldn't catch. She caught it. 3 days passed in the particular purgatory of being a woman waiting to find out her fate in someone else's house. Edmund was attentive in the way of a man completing an obligation. He walked with her in the garden twice. He asked her opinion of the county once. He told her at length about the Holloway family's history. The acreage of the estate, the hunting that was particularly fine in autumn. He spoke to her, she noticed, without ever quite speaking to her, his words landing adjacent to her, rather than arriving at the person she actually was. She spent her hours reading, walking the grounds when the heat allowed, and writing in her notebook. The Eastfield continued to trouble her. On the 4th morning, she walked out to it alone. The grass was heavy with dew still at 7 in the morning, and the air smelled of the red Virginia clay that her father had always said was the most honest soil in the country. It told you everything if you knew how to listen. She walked the perimeter of the field, reading the slope of it with the habit of a surveyor's daughter who had spent childhood following her father through lands exactly like this one. She was right. The drainage channels were wrong. Badly wrong. Not catastrophically, not yet, but in a way that would become catastrophic within 2 or 3 seasons if the rainfall patterns held. The low corner of the field was already showing the subtle signs she recognized. A certain darkness to the soil, a flatness in the grass growth, a pattern to the way the roots had pushed. She was making notes when she heard a horse. She looked up. James Whitmore sat on a gray horse at the edge of the field. Watching her, he did not call out immediately. He sat the horse with the ease of a man who had been in the saddle since before he could walk. And he watched her with that same unhurried attention she had noticed at supper. Then he walked the horse forward. Miss Ashworth. Whitmore. He looked at the notebook in her hand. He looked at the field. He looked back at her. "What did you find?" She blinked. It was not the question she had expected. "The drainage channel along the east edge is graded at the wrong angle," she said. "The field drops 2 degrees lower toward the southeast corner than the channel accounts for. In a wet season, you'd lose 1/3 of the crop yield in that corner minimum. Possibly half." He was quiet for a moment. "That's Holloway's field, I know. You're a guest at Holloway's house. I know that too," she said. She looked up at him steadily. "I notice problems I can fix. I can't seem to stop myself." Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but the suggestion of one, brief as a shadow crossing a wall. "My south field has the same problem," he said. "Worse? Maybe. My foreman says I'm imagining it." She met his eyes. "Your foreman is wrong," they almost began. "I reckon he might be." He looked at the notebook. "Your father taught you this?" "My father took me with him on every survey from the time I was 8 years old," she said. "He didn't have a son. He decided that was no reason to waste what he knew." "Smart man," James Whitmore said. She wasn't certain later why those 2 words hit her the way they did. Smart man, said plainly, no performance in it. No asterisk attached. Smart man for teaching a daughter. I suppose just the simple acknowledgement that her father's choice had been a good one. And by extension, that what she carried was worth carrying. She looked back at the east field so he wouldn't see her expression. "Are you planning to tell Holloway about the drainage?" he asked. "I thought I might." He nodded slowly. He turned the horse. Then he paused and looked back over his shoulder. "When you do," he said, "don't let Caldwell be in the room. He'll take credit for it inside of 10 minutes. He rode away. She stood in the field for a long moment after. Then she opened her notebook and wrote something that had nothing to do with drainage. The evening it broke open, she had not planned it. The Caldwells were back for supper. They seemed to be always at Holloway Hall. eating Cornelius Holloway's food and drinking his wine and filling the rooms with laughter that had a slightly cruel edge to it. The laughter of people who feel more comfortable when the world is arranged below them. Edmund was in particularly fine spirits. He had been hunting that morning, and the morning's success had polished his already high opinion of himself to a bright shine. Clara sat at the table and kept her own counsel, until Caldwell's wife, a narrow woman named Harriet who wore her opinions the way other women wore jewelry, openly and often looked across the table and said, "I understand your father is quite unwell, Miss Ashworth. I do hope the arrangement here is providing some comfort to you. It must be a relief having a situation secured." Clara set her glass. "I beg your pardon?" "Well, a woman in your position," Harriet Caldwell paused as if she were being gentle. "One does what one must." "Doesn't one? Not all of us can afford to wait for love," she smiled. It was the smile of a woman who considered herself compassionate. Pragmatism is its own kind of virtue. The table waited. Edmund picked up his fork. "Miss Ashworth is a practical woman," he said. With the ease of a man who did not notice he had just echoed and approved the insult. "That is precisely what is needed to manage a house of this size." Clara looked at Edmund for a moment. Then she looked at Harriet Caldwell. Then she said, "With perfect evenness, my father is recovering well. Thank you. And I am not here because I have no other option. Mrs. Caldwell, I am here because my father was asked to consider this proposal, and I came to see if the situation was worth considering." She paused. "I haven't decided yet." The silence was the kind that rang. Cornelius Holloway's face tightened. Edmund's fork stopped halfway to his plate. Harriet Caldwell's smile became something more uncertain. And from across the room she hadn't heard him come in. "Hadn't known he was there," James Whitmore said, from the doorway. "Forgive me. I was told supper was at 8. He looked at the room. His eyes found Clara for one moment. Then he moved to his place at the table as though nothing had happened. As though he had heard nothing. As though the air in the room were not vibrating with the specific tension of a woman who had just refused to be diminished. But when the food was passed and the conversation resumed its careful performance, she felt something shift in the architecture of the room. She had named herself. She had refused to be made small. And the quietest man at the table had witnessed it. It was George Whitmore who told her, 3 days later, what the stakes truly were. He found her in the library. She had been given permission to use it and used it every morning, finding it the only room in the house where she could breathe without calculation. He was perhaps 65, with a kind face gone leathery and the direct speech of a man too old to waste time being indirect. He said, "Miss Ashworth, I'll ask your pardon for speaking plainly. I prefer plain speech," she said. "I thought you might." He sat down in the chair across from her. "James tells me you identified the drainage problem in the East Field. He mentioned it to you?" "He mentions very little to anyone. That he mentioned it to me means he was thinking on it." George folded his hands on his knee. "Miss Ashworth, I'm going to tell you something about this county that you may have begun to suspect. Cornelius Holloway is not a prosperous man. The house is fine. Yes, the horses are fine, but the land," he paused. "The land has been mismanaged for 15 years. The debts are considerable." She kept her face still. "Edmund is to be married," George continued, "because the Holloway lands need a bride, with a dowry large enough to address certain obligations. Your father's situation," he stopped again, with the delicacy of a man touching a bruise. "Your father's situation was represented to Cornelius in somewhat different terms than the reality. I believe Cornelius understood the dowry to be larger than it is." Clara felt something cold move through her chest. "He was misled. He was made to understand what was useful to him," George said carefully. "Whether that constitutes being misled depends on how charitable one wishes to be." She looked down at her hands. "And when he learns the truth, he already suspects it. A man named Harker, his accountant, came 2 days ago, and there was a discussion." George held her gaze. "I believe Edmund will be directed to look elsewhere." I believe you may be sent home within the fortnight." She sat very still. Not because she was afraid of being sent home. She had not wanted to be here. But being sent home would mean her father knowing that she had not been enough, that the provision had fallen through, that the plan had collapsed. It would break something in him that she wasn't sure would mend. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. George looked at her for a long, considering moment. "Because my brother asked me to," he said. "And James does not ask easily." She found James Whitmore at the paddock fence that evening. She had not planned it. She had simply walked until she ran out of ways to circle the same thought. And he was at the paddock fence, watching the horses in the last of the light. And she stopped beside him, because it seemed like the honest thing to do. They stood in silence for a moment. "You asked your brother to warn me," she said. He didn't deserve to know. Why? He was quiet. The horses moved in the paddock. The summer dark was gathering at the edge of the sky, purple and soft, and the heat of the day was only just beginning to ease. "Because what's happening to you isn't right," he said. "And because I believe you can handle the truth better than most people in this county can handle comfort." She looked at the horses. "What do you want, Mr. Whitmore?" she asked. Not unkindly, but directly. He turned to look at her then, the full weight of that gaze unhurried. Clear, not asking anything from her except that she be exactly what she was. "I need someone who can read land," he said. "My Southfield is worse than you think. My foreman has been lying to me for 2 years, and I've been too busy trying to save other parts of the estate to see it clearly. I need someone who can look at the Whitmore lands without a stake in telling me what I want to hear." He paused. "And I suspect you need somewhere to be that isn't here." She looked at him. "You're offering me a job," she said. "I'm offering you a fair situation," he said. "Work you're suited for, pay that respects that work, and no obligation beyond what the work requires." She thought of her father. She thought of the letter. She thought of Edmund's smile and Harriet Caldwell's compassion and the East Field with its wrongly graded drainage channel. She thought of this man saying "smart man" about her father plainly, with no asterisk, no performance. "I'll look at your Southfield," she said. The almost smile. "Before it gets too hot." She nodded. She started to turn back toward the house. "Miss Ashworth." She looked back. "You were right," he said. "What you said at supper about not having decided." She waited. "For what it's worth," he said. "Anyone who knows anything about this county could have told Holloway he'd find you more than he bargained for." He said it without flattery, without performance. The way he said everything as though words were not currency to be spent impressing people, but weight to be placed carefully, and only when they meant something. She walked back to the house. She did not sleep well. But for the first time since the wagon had rolled through Hargrove, it wasn't fear that kept her awake. It was the feeling of something opening. Something that had been shut for a very long time. The letter she wrote to her father that night was 2 pages. She told him the situation as it stood. She told him what George had said. She told him what James Whitmore had offered. She told him she was not afraid. She did not tell him about the paddock fence, or the almost smile, or the 2 words "smart man" that she could still feel settling somewhere quiet in her chest. There were things a woman kept for herself. She folded the letter, sealed it, set it on the writing desk to be posted in the morning. Then she opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top, "Whitmore Southfield." Begin underneath that. She drew the first lines of a survey grid. Her hand was steady. Her hand had always been steady through every hard thing. Every smaller life than she deserved. Every room full of people who looked at her and saw only what she lacked. It was the one thing they had never been able to take from her. And now, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, it felt like the steadiness might actually have somewhere to go. The morning James Whitmore rode out to meet her at the Southfield. He brought no foreman with him. That was the first thing Clara noticed. He came alone, on the gray horse, with a second mount on a lead line, a smaller bay mare. Quiet-eyed and steady, and he handed her the reins without ceremony. Without asking whether she rode, without the particular brand of careful condescension that men in this county seem to carry the way other men carried pocket watches. "I assumed," he said. "You assumed correctly," she said. And mounted. They rode the perimeter of the south field before either of them spoke again. And Clara spent those first minutes doing what she always did, reading. Not the prettiness of the land, not the romance of the Virginia summer, stretched golden and heavy on either side of them, but the truth of it, the way the soil lay, the way the grass grew in uneven patches near the low end, the way the creek that ran along the southern boundary moved slower than it should have for the slope of the land. She pulled her notebook from her coat pocket. "Tell me what your foreman told you about the yield drop," she said. James rode alongside her without looking at her. Said it was the seed. Said the supplier had sold us an inferior batch 2 seasons back and the soil hadn't recovered. And you believed him? A pause. I believed him the first season. By the second, I was starting to doubt. Why did you keep him on? He turned to look at her then. Because I didn't have anyone who could tell me what the real problem was. And a man with the wrong answer is at least a man who knows the land. I didn't want to start from nothing. Clara wrote something in her notebook. What's his name? The foreman, Holt. Davis Holt. He's been on the Whitmore land for 12 years. 12 years, she said. Long enough to know exactly which problems to point at and which ones to walk you past. James said nothing. But his jaw did the thing she had come to recognize, a slight tightening. The expression of a man who was hearing confirmed what he had already, privately, begun to fear. They reached the southeast corner of the field and Clara dismounted. She crouched at the edge of the crop line and pressed 2 fingers into the earth and held them there. Then she stood and walked 20 feet to her left and did it again. She did this 4 times before she said anything. "It's not the seed," she said. "No. The water table in this corner is sitting 6 inches higher than it should be. Your drainage ditch along the south fence is blocked, probably has been for at least 2 seasons. Maybe 3. The roots in this section are drowning. They look alive from the surface because the plant keeps reaching up. But underneath," she looked at the crop line. "Underneath, they're already failing." James was standing at her shoulder, not crowding her, just close enough that she knew he was listening with his whole attention. "What do I do?" he asked. And there it was again, that thing he did that no one else in this county seemed capable of. He did not say, "What would you suggest?" in the tone of a man humoring a novelty. He did not say, "I'll have to run that past Holt." He said, "What do I do?" The plain, unguarded question of a man who had already decided she was someone worth asking. She told him. She told him clearly, and without softening it, the drainage ditch would need to be cleared and regraded along its entire southern run. The crop in the failing corner would need to come out entirely this season, and the soil rested and rebuilt. The seed quality wasn't the issue, but the supplier should be audited anyway, because 2 lies often traveled together. She told him it would cost him a season's yield in that corner. Minimum. And that the foreman almost certainly knew about the blocked drainage and had been steering him away from it for reasons that were worth examining carefully. James listened. He did not interrupt. He did not qualify. When she finished, he said, "How long would it take you to put this in writing?" "Everything you've just told me. Survey notes, recommendations." "The whole of it." She looked at him. "Why? Because I intend to put Holt in front of it," he said. "And I want a document that doesn't give him room to argue with the edges." She thought about that. 2 days, she said. "Maybe 3 if I walk the full boundary." "Walk the full boundary," he said. "I'll want to know everything." She walked the full boundary. She spent 2.5 days on the Whitmore land, notebook in hand, rising before the heat set in, and working through the morning with the focused, unhurried attention her father had taught her. James did not hover. He appeared at intervals, once to bring water, once to ask a question about the creek gradient, once simply to ride alongside her for half an hour in complete silence, which she found, to her own surprise, entirely comfortable. On the morning of the third day, she came back to Holloway Hall to find that Edmund had decided they needed to talk. He was waiting in the parlor. That was how she knew it had been arranged. Edmund Holloway did not wait for anyone. He was the kind of man who arrived when he chose and departed when, and expected the world to arrange itself around his schedule. Seeing him seated in the parlor before 9 in the morning, his hands folded with studied patience, she understood immediately that someone had told him something, and that the something had complicated his plans. She sat across from him. She did not offer him a preamble. "Your father spoke to you," she said. Edmund blinked. It was clearly not the opening he had expected. "He did," he said after a beat. "He felt I should have a direct conversation with you about the practicalities of our situation." "The practicalities," she said. "You mean the dowry?" The careful arrangement of Edmund's face shifted almost imperceptibly. "He mentioned that there may have been some miscommunication regarding your father's current financial." "My father is not wealthy," she said. "He never was. If your father believed otherwise, that is a misunderstanding I regret but did not create." She looked at him steadily. "What would you like to say to me, Mr. Holloway?" Edmund was quiet for a moment. He looked briefly, like a man who was genuinely trying to find the right words, and she gave him credit for that. At least for the effort. He was not a villain. That was almost the most dispiriting thing about him. He was simply a man who had been formed entirely by ease. And ease had made him smaller than he might have been. "I think," he said carefully, "that it may have been premature to extend this invitation, given the circumstances." "You'd like me to leave," she said. I think he paused. "I think it would be in both our interests to acknowledge that the arrangement, as originally understood, is no longer Mr. Holloway." She kept her voice even. "You can say it plainly." "It won't damage me." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, something that might, in a more reflective man, have become shame. "I'm sorry," he said. Genuinely. She believed that he was. It didn't change anything. "When would you like me to go?" she asked. "The end of the week," he said. "I'll arrange the wagon." She nodded. She stood. She was at the door of the parlor when he said, "Miss Ashworth, for what it's worth, I think you are. I think you deserve better than this situation afforded." She turned back and looked at him. He meant it. She could see that, too. "Yes," she said. "I do." She walked out. She did not go to her room. She went to the library, sat at the writing desk, and finished the survey report she had been drafting for James Whitmore. She worked for 2 hours straight, in the focused silence that had always been her best company, writing everything she had found in precise, well-documented, irrefutable language. When she set her pen down, she had 14 pages. Then she sat with her hands flat on the desk and thought about her father. He would try not to let her see how it hurt when she came back. He would ask careful questions and listen carefully to the answers, and he would fold the truth into himself quietly and say something like, "We'll manage." Clara, in the voice he used when he didn't want her to see that he was afraid. She knew that voice. She had loved him for 24 years and she knew every register of him. The way you know a landscape you grew up in. She would not let this break him. But the arithmetic of the situation was brutal. The house in Richmond was rented on the thinning strength of savings that were now genuinely running low. Her father's hands shook when he was tired, which was often. The surveying work was gone, had been gone for 3 years. She had taken in sewing in Richmond, had tutored 2 families' daughters in the basics of letters and sums, had managed their small household with the precision of someone running a military campaign on civilian supplies. None of it was enough. It had never quite been enough. And they had both known it, and neither of them had said so, because saying so would have made it too real to carry. She picked up her pen again. She wrote a letter, not to her father, to James Whitmore. She told him she was leaving at the end of the week. She told him the survey report was complete, and she would deliver it before she left. She told him she hoped the information would be of use, and that she was sorry she could not be of more. She read it back. Then she set it aside and wrote another one. Mr. Whitmore, you asked me what I needed. I believe the honest answer is work. Not charity. Work that makes use of what I know. If the survey report I have prepared demonstrates an adequate understanding of the Whitmore lands, and if you are still of the mind that an honest assessment is worth having, I would ask you to consider whether there is a longer engagement that might benefit us both. I am not in a position to ask for anything I have not earned, but I am in a position to do work that is worth asking for. C. Ashworth. She read that one back twice. Then she folded it, wrote his name on the front, and put it in the pocket of her coat. She would decide whether to give it to him after she delivered the report. Davis Holt was at the Whitmore stable when she arrived the next morning. She had not expected to encounter him. She had planned to deliver the report to James directly and be gone before the morning got old. But Holt was at the stable door when she dismounted, a thick-armed man of about 50, with a face that had weathered into something flat and watchful, and eyes that moved over her with an assessment she recognized and did not like. Miss Ashworth, he said, you've been doing some walking on the south field. I have, she said. Pretty far south. He leaned against the doorframe. All the way to the creek line. Yes, she kept her voice even. Mr. Whitmore know you went that far. He asked me to walk the full boundary, she said. So I did. Holt looked at the notebook under her arm. He looked at the leather satchel she carried with the survey report inside it. His expression was the expression of a man reading a situation and calculating what it cost him. Women don't usually work land like this, he said. Not hostilely, almost conversationally. The way a man says something when he wants to see if you'll flinch. No, she agreed. They usually don't. So whatever you think you found out there, he paused. I'd be careful about how you put it to Mr. Whitmore. Man's been under a lot of pressure. Doesn't benefit him to have someone stirring up trouble with findings that might not account for the full picture. She looked at him. What part of the picture do you think I'm missing? Mr. Holt? He smiled. It was a measured smile, the long view, he said. I've worked this land 12 years. A woman with a notebook and a week's walking, she doesn't have the long view. You're right, Clara said. I don't have 12 years. What I have is a blocked drainage ditch that's been killing the South Field for at least 3 seasons. And a survey document that says so, in language your employer will have no trouble reading. She held his gaze. If there's a part of that picture I'm missing, I'd genuinely like to know what it is. Holt's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. You've got a sharp tongue on you, he said. I've got accurate findings, she said. The tongue is incidental. She walked past him and into the house. Her hands inside her coat pockets were not quite steady. She made them steady before she knocked on the study door. James read the report the way she had hoped, straight through. Without interrupting, without looking up to ask questions. Just working through it with the focused attention of a man who understood that a document like this deserved to be met with full presence. She sat across from him and watched his face and let the silence do its work. When he finished the last page, he set it down. He looked at her. Holt knew, he said. It was not a question. I can't prove it, she said. But the drainage ditch didn't block overnight. Someone has been clearing the worst of it just enough to keep it from being obvious, while letting the real damage accumulate. That takes tending. It takes someone who knows where to look and chooses not to look honestly. James was very still. For 2 years he's told me the field will recover. For 2 years the field has been getting worse. He stood up from behind the desk. He walked to the window and stood with his back to her. And she watched the set of his shoulders and read in them what she had come to understand was his particular form of expression, not dramatics. Not performance, but the controlled weight of a man feeling something genuinely large and choosing how to carry it. "What do I do?" he said, and there was something different in the way he said it this time. Not the practical question about drainage, something else. Something that had to do with 12 years of a man he'd trusted and the specific ache of finding out what trust had cost him. She answered him carefully. "You put the report in front of him. You let him explain what he can explain. You let the document be what it is." She paused. "And then you decide what 12 years is worth set against what's true." He turned back from the window. He looked at her for a long moment. "You've had to do that," he said. Weigh loyalty against truth. She thought about her father. About the letter she had burned. About the wagon coming at the end of the week. "Yes," she said. "How do you do it without losing the loyalty entirely?" She thought about that. "You decide what you're loyal to," she said slowly. "Whether it's the person or the version of the person you believed in. Sometimes they're the same thing. Sometimes they're not. And when they're not," she stopped, "you grieve what you thought was true. And then you act on what is." He was quiet for a moment. "That's harder than it sounds," he said. "Everything worth doing is," she said. The room held the weight of that for a beat. Then he said, "You're leaving at the end of the week." "Yes, Edmund." He nodded. He looked at the report on the desk. Then he looked at her. And the directness of it, the steady, uncalculated directness that was simply who he was, made her reach into her coat pocket before she had fully decided to. She set the letter on the desk. He looked at it. Looked at his name on the front. Looked at her. "Read it when I'm gone," she said. "If you think there's something in it worth responding to. You know where I'll be." She left before he could open it. She was halfway down the drive when she heard him behind her. "Miss Ashworth." She stopped. She turned. He was standing at the top of the steps, the letter in his hand. He had read it, or at least read enough of it. His expression was the most open she had seen on him. Which still was not a wide-open expression, but it was more than she had earned from most people. "You said work that makes use of what you know," he said. "Yes, the Whitmore lands need a proper survey, not just the Southfield. The whole of it, boundaries, water, soil, drainage. Every inch." He looked at the letter and then at her. "That's 6 months of work minimum, possibly 8. She kept very still. I said, "I'm not asking for charity. I know what you said." He came down 2 steps. "I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a contract. Fair wages for honest work." He paused. "There's a cottage on the east edge of the property. It's been empty 2 years. It needs some work. But it's a place." She looked at him. She thought about her father, and the letter, and the end of the week, and the wagon. "My father," she said. "There's room in the cottage," he said simply. "If he's well enough to travel, and you'd want him near." Something cracked open in her chest, a hairline fracture in the wall she'd been holding. She looked away, down the drive, at nothing in particular. She pressed her lips together and breathed until she was sure her voice would be steady. "You'd need to know," she said, "that where I go, people talk. A woman alone, living on a man's property, doing a man's work. In this county," she looked back at him, "people will talk. Let them," he said. And the flatness in his voice when he said it, the complete, unperformative indifference to what the Caldwells and the Merritts and the Holloways of Hargrove County might say, was more reassuring than any elaborate defense could have been. "I'll need the contract in writing," she said. "Of course," he said. "And the wages agreed before I start." "Agreed." He came down the last 2 steps. He was standing level with her now. "Do you want to discuss the figure now or after you've thought on it?" "Now," she said. "I don't like things left uncertain." He told her the figure. It was fair. More than fair. It was the wage of a man who understood the value of what he was purchasing and was not interested in underpaying it. She held out her hand. He shook it. His grip was firm and brief and completely without theater. "I'll need to go back to Richmond first," she said. "A week, maybe 2. I'll hold the cottage," he said. She nodded. She turned to go, Miss Ashworth. She looked back. There was something in his face she couldn't quite name, not quite what she would have called warmth. Because warmth was not the right word for James Whitmore. But something adjacent to it. Something real. Holt, he said. I'm going to put your report in front of him this afternoon. She waited. You should know, he said, that he'll probably deny it. And he'll probably say something about you, about your qualifications. About what a woman could know about a field. He held her gaze. I want you to know before you go that nothing he says will change what that document says. Or what I know it to be worth. She stood very still. Thank you, she said. And she meant it, and she said it plainly. And she did not make it smaller than it was. She walked back to Holloway Hall and packed her trunk. Edmund, to his credit, said goodbye with genuine courtesy. Cornelius Holloway did not appear. Harriet Caldwell was not there, for which Clara was quietly grateful. The wagon came at 8 in the morning on Friday, and Clara lifted her own trunk, and the driver made no comment. And the road out of Hargrove looked different going than it had coming. She spent the ride to Richmond with her notebook open on her knee, working through the initial survey plan for the Whitmore lands. She had the boundary lines rough sketched by the time the wagon reached the outskirts of the city, and the framework for the drainage assessment half done, and the first 2 pages of what would become the most thorough survey of Whitmore Valley in 30 years. She thought about James Whitmore putting her report in front of Davis Holt that afternoon. She thought about what Holt's face had looked like at the stable door, doing his calculations. She thought about 12 years, and what a man could build in that time that had nothing to do with the land and everything to do with the trust of the person who owned it. She thought about James saying, let them, about the county's talk, with that flat and complete indifference. She wrote in her notebook. She did not look back at Hargrove. She was not running from it. She was moving toward something, toward the cottage, on the east edge of the Whitmore property, toward 6 months of work that was worth doing, toward the strange and still new feeling of being useful in a way that was honest and entirely her own. Her father would worry. He would have questions. She would answer them honestly, and she would hold them for him when the answers were hard. But first she had to see his face when she told him there was room in the cottage, and that it was already being held. The wagon wheels turned. Richmond was 2 hours ahead, and behind her in Hargrove County, a man she was still learning to read was walking back into his house with a 14-page document and a decision to make that would ripple through everything that came after. She thought she knew already what he would decide. She was learning, slowly, to trust that knowledge, the kind that lived below the surface, in the same quiet place where a surveyor's daughter learned to read the land. The kind of knowing that did not announce itself, it simply was. Her father cried. He tried not to. He turned away from her at the kitchen table and made a business of refilling his cup. And his shoulders did the thing they did when he was holding something large, a slight drawing inward. A careful stillness, and when he turned back, his eyes were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lamplight. The cottage, he said, on the Whitmore property. It needs some work, Clara said. But it's solid, and it's ours for as long as the contract holds. He set his cup down. He looked at his hands, the surveyor's hands, the ones that had shaken for 3 years now, that had lost the precision that had once been their entire worth. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at her. This man, he said, Whitmore. James Whitmore, she said. He offered you a contract, a fair one, wages agreed in advance. 6 months minimum, possibly 8. Her father was quiet. She could see him working through it, the arithmetic. The pride, the relief he didn't want to show, because showing it meant admitting how close to the edge they'd been standing. He's a good man, he asked finally. She thought about the paddock fence. The almost smile, let them. He's an honest one, she said. In my experience, that's rarer and worth more. Her father nodded slowly. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. "Your mother would have known what to say to this," he said. Something that made it feel right instead of just practical. "It is right," Clara said. "And it is practical. Those aren't different things." He squeezed her hand once. Then he straightened. "When do we leave?" They arrived at the Whitmore cottage on a Tuesday. 10 days after Clara had shaken James Whitmore's hand on the drive and walked away with her trunk and her notebook and the particular kind of hope that doesn't announce itself because it's learned to be careful. The cottage was exactly what James had described empty 2 years. Needing work but solid in its bones. Her father walked through it with his old surveyor's eye and declared the foundation sound and the roof adequate and the eastern wall better hung than he'd expected. And Clara watched him move through the rooms with something waking up behind his eyes. The focused assessment of a man whose mind still knew exactly how to do the thing his hands could no longer quite manage. James met them at the property line. He shook her father's hand with the same directness he brought to everything. And her father, who had always been an accurate reader of men, looked at him for a moment and then said, "My daughter tells me you read her survey report straight through without interrupting." James looked at him. "Yes, sir." "Good," her father said with the finality of a verdict. And that was that. James showed them the cottage. He had arranged for the roof to be checked and a broken window replaced and firewood stacked along the north wall. He did not make a ceremony of it. He showed them what had been done. Mentioned that the well had been cleared 2 days prior. And told Clara he expected to begin the full survey the following Monday. Weather permitting. "What about Holt?" she asked, when her father had gone inside to decide which room would be his. James looked at her steadily. "Holt is gone," he said. She absorbed that. He denied it? He denied everything for about 15 minutes. A pause. Then he stopped denying it. "What did he say?" He said started small. A corner of the drainage, he told himself, would sort itself out. Then it didn't sort itself out, and by the time he knew the scope of it, he was in deep enough that telling me the truth would cost him the position. James looked toward the south field, visible in the distance. He figured if the yields kept dropping slowly enough, I'd blame the weather, blame the seeds, spend money on the wrong fixes. By the time I found the real problem, he'd have enough saved to move on. Clara said nothing for a moment. "Did you believe him? That it started small?" "Yes," James said. "That's the part that's hardest to sit with. I think it did start small. I think that's how most dishonesty starts." He looked at her. "Small enough that the man telling himself the story can almost make himself believe it's not a choice." She thought about that. She thought about Edmund in the parlor saying, "I'm sorry," genuinely, and meaning it, and how meaning something and doing it anyway was its own particular kind of accounting. "What will you do about the position?" she asked. "I'll manage without a foreman until the survey's done," he said. "Then I'll know what I actually have and what I actually need. No point hiring someone to oversee land I don't yet understand." "That's sensible," she said. "I've been told I'm sensible," he said. "Usually it isn't meant as a compliment. I mean it as one," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked toward the cottage. "Your father," he said. "Is he well enough for this?" The move, the adjustment. Something tightened in her chest, not uncomfortably, but with the specific ache of gratitude when it arrives unexpectedly. "He will be better for having something to look at, besides the walls in Richmond," she said. "He misses the land, he's been without it too long." James nodded. "If he wants to walk the property while you're working," he stopped himself. "What?" "I was going to say I'd welcome his opinion on the north boundary. The old survey was done 20 years ago, and I've never entirely trusted the northeast corner markers. But I don't want to." Another pause. "I don't know what he's able to manage." Clara felt something open in her chest that she had been holding carefully shut for a very long time. She looked at this man, this plain-spoken, unhurried, careful man, and felt the specific weight of being seen in the right way. "Ask him," she said. "He'll tell you what he can manage. He's always been honest about his limits." She paused. He just needs someone to ask. James nodded once. He walked toward the cottage, and she heard him as he reached the door. Say Mr. Ashworth in a voice that held something she recognized as the particular respect men give to other men whose knowledge they genuinely want. She turned away and looked at the south field. 6 months of work. Maybe 8. She could hear her father's voice through the cottage wall, answering a question she hadn't heard. Something about markers. Something about the northeast corner. His voice had a tone in it she hadn't heard in 3 years. She opened her notebook and started a new page. The work was real. That was the thing that mattered most to her in those first weeks, not the arrangement. Not the wages, not even the cottage, but the work itself, which was demanding and specific and entirely honest. No performance required, no careful management of other people's impressions of her. Just the land, and the notebook, and the slow accumulation of truth that she recorded line by line until the truth became a document, and the document became knowledge that had weight. She walked the Whitmore property systematically, the way her father had taught her northwest quadrant first, then northeast, then working south. She tested soil at interval. She traced every watercourse. She logged every boundary marker and checked each one against the old survey documents James had found in his study. 3 rolled maps that smelled of age and told the property's history in the particular shorthand of men who had walked this land before her. James appeared in the field most mornings for an hour. Sometimes 2. He didn't hover. He asked good questions, the kind that showed he had read her previous notes before he came out, and when she explained something, he listened the way her father had always listened to the land. With his full attention, without pretending to already know. On the 4th morning, she found something she hadn't expected. She almost walked past it. It was in the north boundary section, in a place where the old survey map showed a straight property line running east along the ridge. She had been checking markers when she noticed that the 4th marker was wrong. Not damaged, not shifted by weather, wrong in a way that had been done deliberately, set 18 inches south of where it should have been. In the kind of precise mismatch that you wouldn't catch unless you were measuring carefully against the original survey. She checked it 3 times. Then she walked the line all the way to the 5th marker, and the 6th, and found that each one had been moved, each one 18 inches south of true, in a line that, if you extended it, moved the Whitmore north boundary significantly into the adjacent property. She sat down on the ridge and looked at her notes. The adjacent property was the Caldwell land. She thought about Charles Caldwell laughing at the supper table. Drainage failures. She thought about Harriet Caldwell's particular brand of compassion. She thought about the way men like Caldwell built their surety, not from actual strength, but from the patient accumulation of small advantages, small shifts, small adjustments that added up over time to something large enough to stand on. She closed her notebook. She rode back to the house. James was in the study when she came in. He looked up from whatever he was reading and read something in her face. Immediately she had learned that about him. That he was a careful watcher who missed very little, though he never wore his watching like a performance. "What did you find?" he said. She sat down. She opened her notebook to the page. She told him. He listened without expression, which was not the same as listening without feeling. She had learned that, too, the difference between a man who felt nothing and a man who felt things quietly. When she finished, he was still for a moment. Then he said, "How long do you think those markers have been wrong? Based on the growth patterns around the base of the marker's moss? Root encroachment, soil compaction, I'd estimate at least 8 years. Possibly 10. He looked at the notes. Before I bought the property. Yes." She paused. "Which means it may have been a condition of the sale. Something Caldwell or his father, if Caldwell didn't manage the transaction, may have engineered before the property changed hands, to ensure that the recorded boundary worked in their favor if anyone ever questioned the line." James set the notes down on the desk. He leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the way of a man doing an internal accounting. "How much land?" he asked. 11 acres along the North Ridge, she said. "Good land. High ground, good range timber worth cutting. 11 acres. He looked at her. "Caldwell has been holding county dinner parties on my land for a decade. It appears so." The silence was charged. Not with rage. James Whitmore was not a man who wore rage. At least not visibly. But with the particular compressed weight of a man who has just discovered that the architecture of a thing he trusted was built on someone else's fraud. "What are my options?" he said. "You could raise it privately with Caldwell," she said carefully. "Give him the opportunity to correct the boundary without involving the county. Some men will do the right thing when given a quiet way to do it. And if he won't, then you take it to the county land office," she said. "With my survey documentation, the original deed, the marker positions, the measurements, all of it. It's a clean case. The documentation is good." She met his gaze. "It will be public. It will be contested. Caldwell has money and standing, and he'll use both. But the documentation is good," James said again. "The documentation is very good," she said. He looked at her steadily. Then he said the thing she had not expected. "This is going to make your situation here harder," he said. "Caldwell will know the survey identified this. He'll know who did the survey." She held his gaze. "I know. He's not a man who takes being exposed quietly." "I know that, too," she said. James picked up her notebook. He looked at the measurements. The careful columns of numbers, the marker positions, the annotations in her precise hand. "Did you know," he said slowly, "when you agreed to take this contract, that something like this might be in the land records?" "No," she said honestly. "But I suspected there might be things in the north section that didn't add up. The old survey always bothered my father when he looked at the maps. He said the northeast corner felt wrong." She paused. "He mentioned it to me the second day we were here. Your father." James set the notebook down. "He noticed it 20 years after the survey was filed. He's been noticing land his whole life," she said. "Old habits." James was quiet for a moment. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as what it is, which is not strategy and not business." She waited. "You could have walked past those markers," he said. "You could have measured the line, noted the position, moved on. You could have filed a report that documented the south field and the water system and left the north boundary as a question mark. And I probably would never have pressed you on it." He looked at her. "You didn't do that." "No," she said. "Why?" She thought about it. "The real answer, not the convenient one. Because the land knows the truth," she said finally. "The markers were wrong and the land knew it. My job is to read what the land says, not to decide which parts of it are convenient to hear." He held her gaze for a long moment. "All right," he said. "We take it to Caldwell first. Give him the chance." He picked up her notebook and handed it back to her. "But I want you with me when I do." They went to the Caldwell property on a Thursday morning. Clara had expected James to send a note first. He did not. He rode to the Caldwell property directly, with Clara beside him. And he asked for Charles Caldwell at the door, with the simple directness of a man who saw no reason to give a guilty party time to prepare. Caldwell came to the sitting room looking confident, the confidence of a man on his own ground who had not yet understood what had arrived on it. He looked at Clara with the particular flicker of contempt she had seen at that supper table, quickly arranged into something more neutral. "Whitmore," he said. "And Miss Ashworth." A pause. "I imagine it is," James said. He sat down without being invited to. Clara sat across from him. James looked at Caldwell. "I've had my north boundary resurveyed," he said. "All the way to the ridge." Caldwell's expression shifted by a fraction. "Have you?" "The markers are wrong," James said. "All 6 of them. Running east from the old oak. Moved 18 inches south of where the original deed places the line." He paused. 18 inches, consistently over a quarter-mile run. That's not weather. That's not settlement. You know what that is. Caldwell looked at Clara. And I suppose she found this. Miss Ashworth surveyed the land. Yes, James said. Her documentation is complete and accurate. I've reviewed it myself. Women surveying property lines. Caldwell let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. But close enough to one. James, I've known your family 20 years. Whatever this woman told you, I told him what the measurements say, Clara said. Her voice was even. If you'd like to dispute the measurements, I can walk you to each marker position and demonstrate the methodology. She held his gaze. The math doesn't change because you'd prefer it to. Something hardened in Caldwell's face. You have some nerve, he said. Coming into my home, Caldwell. James's voice was quiet. And it stopped the room. Not because it was raised. Because it was the complete opposite of raised, flat and clear and utterly immovable. I'm giving you the opportunity to correct this without involving the county land office. I'd like to know if you want to take that opportunity. Caldwell looked at him. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, the weighing of options. The assessment of how solid the documentation was. The measurement of James Whitmore's expression against the possibility that it might soften. It did not soften. The markers have been in those positions for as long as I can remember, Caldwell said finally. If there was a surveying error, it predates anything I had a hand in. The error was made 8 to 10 years ago, Clara said. The marker bases show consistent growth patterns. I can document the dating. Caldwell turned to her fully. And his expression was the expression of a man who had decided that the obstacle between him and what he wanted was standing in front of him and ought to know its place. Miss Ashworth, he said carefully, you are a guest in this county. You don't have standing here. Your credentials are your father's. And your father is a retired man whose hands can't hold a transit anymore. Whatever you think you've found enough. James was on his feet. The word hit the room, the way a door being closed hits a room, not violent. But final. Clara felt it in her spine. Caldwell stopped. James looked at him. Miss Ashworth's work is documented. Signed, and will stand in front of any land office in Virginia. What you've just said about her father, he paused. You'll want to think carefully before you say anything like that again. Caldwell's face went through several expressions in quick succession. He landed on something controlled but cold. I'll need to speak to my solicitor, he said. You do that, James said. You have 2 weeks. If I don't hear from you in 2 weeks with a plan to correct the boundary, I take the documentation to the county land office and let the record speak for itself. He looked at Clara. She stood. He looked back at Caldwell. Good morning. They walked out. They were back on their horses and clear of the Caldwell drive before either of them spoke. Clara's heart was going faster than she would have liked. But her hands on the reins were steady, and she kept them steady deliberately. He'll fight it, she said. Yes. James rode without looking at her for a moment. You knew he would. I thought it was the right thing to try first, she said. Giving him the chance. So did I, he glanced at her. For what it's worth, what he said about your father, I heard what he said, she said quietly. I've been hearing versions of it my whole life. She paused. It stops landing when you know it isn't true. He was quiet for a moment. Then does it actually stop landing? She thought about being honest. She chose it, but it stops mattering, he nodded. That might be stronger, he said. Mattering is different from landing. They rode in silence for a stretch. The summer was in full press now, the air close and weighted with heat. And Virginia in July smelled like the particular combination of red clay and cut grass, and something green underneath everything that Clara had always loved without knowing she loved it. Then James said, he's going to come at you. She looked at him. Caldwell, he said, he's going to use whatever he has. The talk that's already started about your being here. Your qualifications, your father. He looked at her directly. I want you to know before that happens that nothing he says or does will change what the contract says or what my word says. I know, she said. I'm not sure you do, he said. Not yet. You're still learning whether to trust it. He looked ahead. I'd rather you knew before you had reason to doubt. She looked at him. The plainness of him. The complete absence of persuasion in it, no rhetoric. No performance. Just a man saying the true thing and leaving it there to be what it was. All right, she said, I'll hold on to that. He nodded once. They rode. The trouble began 4 days later. It didn't come from Caldwell directly. It came through the county the way trouble usually came in small places quietly. At first in the form of a conversation someone overheard. A comment made at the dry goods store, a question asked with careful innocence at the Sunday gathering outside the church. Clara's father heard it first. He came in from his morning walk with George Whitmore. The two of them had developed the habit of a slow circuit of the north property in the early hours. Her father talking through the boundary markers in the detailed and specific language of a man who had gotten some of himself back, and he set his hat on the table and said, "There's talk in the town." Clara looked up from her notes. What kind of talk? The kind that starts with a question. He sat down. George says someone at the feed store was asking whether Whitmore had hired a woman surveyor because he couldn't afford a real one, and whether the survey findings were going to be credible given who made them. Clara set her pen down. And the other kind, her father said, with the careful flatness of a man saying something he hates saying. About you living here, on the property. She had expected it. She had told herself she had expected it, expecting it and sitting across from her father, while he said it were not the same thing. Caldwell, she said. George thinks so. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about James on the drive outside Holloway Hall, saying let them with that complete indifference. She held on to the memory of it the way she had told him she would. It doesn't change the measurement, she said. No, her father said. But it changes the room you have to present them in. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who loved her and was afraid for her, and was trying not to make his fear her burden. Clara, if this becomes a formal dispute at the county level, Caldwell's solicitor against James Whitmore's documentation, you'll be called on to defend the survey in front of men who will already have heard these stories. I know. You'll need to be above reproach. I've always been above reproach, she said. The reproach finds me anyway. She looked at him. Papa, the documentation is good, the measurements are accurate. Caldwell moved those markers, and I can prove it. Whether the room wants to hear it is a different problem. Her father looked at her for a long time. You're more like your mother than I've ever told you, he said. Her throat tightened. How so? She never flinched either, he said. She just kept being right until the world caught up. James called on her that same evening. He came to the cottage door, knocked, waited, came in when she opened it, stood in the small sitting room with his hat in his hands, which was the only concession he made to formality. He told her what George had told him, which was the same as what her father had told her, which meant it was spreading, and the spreading was deliberate. I've written to my solicitor in Richmond, he said. He's coming out next week. I want the boundary dispute formally filed before Caldwell can manage the framing of it. That's the right move, she said. First to file sets the terms of the record, I know. He paused. There's something else. He looked at her with the directness that was simply who he was. Undecorated, unperformed. My solicitor is going to want to know the full state of the survey. How far along it is. What else you found. I can prepare a full report for him, she said. He may also want to speak to your father, James said. His original knowledge of the land maps the fact the northeast section before you began. The survey establishes that the anomaly was identifiable by an experienced eye before your work began. It strengthens the case that this wasn't manufactured. Clara felt the weight of that settle. My father is ill, she said, not a refusal. Just a truth she put on the table. I know, James said. I won't press him into anything that costs him. But if he's willing, he'll be willing, she said. He'd walk to Richmond and back for a chance to put a name to good work. She paused. He'd do it for you. James looked at her. Something quiet moved in his expression. He hardly knows me. He knows you asked for his opinion about the northeast corner markers, she said. On the second day, before you had any reason to. She met his gaze. That's enough for him. The room was still for a moment. Outside, the summer dark had settled, and the sounds of the property insects, a distant horse, wind in the trees along the south field, came through the window like a kind of breathing. Miss Ashworth, James said. She looked at him. When this is over, he stopped. When it's over, she said, the land will be right. And that's what matters. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly the duration of a business conversation. Yes, he said, that's what matters. He put his hat back on. He said good night. He walked out. She stood in the middle of the small sitting room and listened to his horse on the road. Then she went to the desk and opened her notebook to a fresh page and wrote at the top, Full Boundary Report Solicitor Copy Begin. She worked until past midnight. The lamp burned low. She did not notice. The solicitor's name was Robert Hale, and he arrived from Richmond on a Wednesday with a leather case, a sharp eye, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to men who have spent 30 years in rooms where every word cost something. He shook Clara's hand without hesitation. That told her something. He sat in James Whitmore's study and read through her full boundary report in 40 minutes without speaking. When he finished, he set the last page down and looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. You measured each marker position against the original deed reference points, he said. Yes, sir. And you cross-referenced against the creek line as a fixed natural boundary. The creek line and 2 granite outcroppings that appear in the original 1798 survey as permanent markers. Those can't be moved. She paused. The fraudulent markers were placed to reference each other, not to reference the fixed points. If you measure them against each other, the line looks consistent. If you measure them against the creek and the outcroppings, the 18-inch discrepancy is clear. Hale looked at James. She's right, he said. This is clean documentation. Caldwell's solicitor is going to have a hard time with this. Caldwell's solicitor will argue that the original survey was itself in error, James said. That the 1,798 boundaries were imprecise, and the current markers represent a good faith correction. Can he sustain that argument? Hale asked. He'll try, James said. Clara said he can't sustain it. The 1,798 survey was done by Thomas Aldridge. He was the best surveyor in the county. At the time, my father worked under him for 3 years. His methods were precise, and his documentation is in the county land office archive. If Caldwell's solicitor wants to argue Aldridge made an 18-inch error that ran consistent for a quarter mile, he'll need to explain why Aldridge's other surveys from the same period show no such pattern. She looked at Hale. They don't. Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled, a brief, controlled expression. The smile of a man who recognized quality and was not surprised by it, but was nonetheless pleased. You checked, he said. While I was in Richmond before I returned, she said. I requested the Aldridge files from the county archive. Hale looked at James. Where did you find her? James said nothing. But the look he gave Clara was one she would turn over in her mind later, in the quiet of the cottage, trying to read what was underneath it. They filed the dispute formally that Friday. The effect on the county was immediate and electric, in the way that things become electric, in small places where everyone knows everyone, and a single piece of news changes the geometry of every relationship simultaneously. By Sunday, the question of the Whitmore North boundary was the only thing anyone in Hargrove County was talking about. By Monday, it had split into factions: those who believed Caldwell, those who believed Whitmore, and the largest group of all, the ones who believed whatever they believed based on who they were related to and what the outcome would cost them. Clara heard it on her walk into town Tuesday morning. She went to the dry goods store for writing paper and ink. And she could feel the shift the moment she walked in, the particular change in a room's atmosphere when the person being discussed enters it. The conversations didn't stop, but they paused, reorganized, became slightly louder in the places that weren't about her, and slightly quieter in the places that were. She bought her paper. She bought her ink. She said good morning to the shopkeeper, who responded with the careful neutrality of a man navigating between two paying customers. And she walked back out. On the porch, she nearly collided with Edmund Holloway. She stopped. He stopped. They looked at each other with the particular awkwardness of two people who had parted on civil terms and weren't sure which version of civility this encounter required. "Miss Ashworth," he said. "Mr. Holloway." He looked better than he had at Holloway Hall, easier. Somehow, she wondered if the relief of the arrangement falling through had loosened something in him. "I've been following the news about the boundary dispute," he said. "It's remarkable what you found." "It was in the land," she said. "I just read it." He paused. "My father," he stopped. Started again. "I don't think my father behaved well. Regarding you. I want you to know I didn't, that I told him so." She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that. "Thank you," she said. "That was honest of you." "I'm not always honest," he said, with something that might have been the beginning of self-knowledge. "But I'm trying to be more so." He looked at the packet of paper in her arms. "You're documenting everything." "Everything," she said. He nodded slowly. "Caldwell has a long reach in this county," he said. "You should know that. And yet you filed." "The documentation is sound," she said. "A long reach doesn't make wrong measurements right." Edmund looked at her for a moment. "No," he said, "I suppose it doesn't." He tipped his hat. "Good luck, Miss Ashworth." "Thank you, Mr. Holloway." She walked back toward the Whitmore property with the paper and ink under her arm, and Edmund Holloway's civility small and warm in her chest, not because she wanted anything from him, but because small corrections were still corrections, and she had learned to take them where they came. The first direct attack came 4 days later. Clara was at the north boundary, running the final verification measurements that Hale had requested, double-checking everything against the fixed geological points, when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to find 2 riders on the ridge above her. She recognized one of them, a man named Perkins, who worked as Caldwell's farm manager. The other she didn't know. They sat their horses and watched her for a long moment. Then Perkins said, loudly enough that she was meant to hear, "Funny thing, a woman measuring land, like a child measuring a river, doesn't change the river." Clara continued her measurement. She wrote it in her notebook. She moved to the next position. "Mr. Whitmore, know you're out here alone," Perkins said. "Mr. Whitmore requested these measurements," she said without looking up. "Reckon he'd be surprised to know what else you're recording out here," Perkins said. "What stories you're building." She stopped. She looked up. She looked at both men directly, the clear, unhurried look that she had never been able to help. The look that her mother apparently also had. The look that said she was not afraid of being looked at. "I record measurements," she said, "in the language of numbers, which doesn't have opinions and doesn't tell stories." She held Perkins' gaze. "If Mr. Caldwell would like to send someone with a transit and a plumb line to run the same measurements, he's welcome to. The numbers will say the same thing they'd the first time." Perkins' jaw tightened. "You've got a real high opinion of yourself," he said. "I have an accurate opinion of my work," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." She looked back down at her notebook. She heard the horses move off after a moment. Her pulse was elevated. She breathed through it, counted measurements, and kept working until the shaking in her hands resolved itself back into steadiness. When she got back to the cottage that evening, she wrote down the encounter. Date, time, who was present, what was said, verbatim as she could recall it. She had learned from her father, the record was everything. The record outlasted memory. The record outlasted men who tried to manage what you remembered. She put it in the file with everything else. James was at the cottage that night when the second thing happened. He had come to review the verification measurements. They had fallen into the habit of evening meetings at the cottage. A working supper that her father sometimes joined and sometimes watched from his chair by the window, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has found his right place again, and they were going through the final page of numbers when George Whitmore knocked and came in with a look on his face that Clara had not seen on him before. George was not a man who alarmed easily. He had the settled quality of someone who had lived long enough that very few things were genuinely surprising. So when he came in with that look tightly controlled, careful, both Clara and James were on their feet before he'd said a word. "There's been a fire," George said. "The north storage barn. Started an hour ago." James was already at the door. "Anyone hurt?" Clara asked. "No, caught early. One of the hands saw it." George's eyes moved to James. "The barn is gone, but the field is untouched. The wind held." James stopped at the door. He turned back. His face was the controlled, compressed expression she had come to recognize as the outside of something large. "The barn," he said. "The one where we were storing the old property maps." George held his gaze. "Yes." The room went quiet. Clara felt the cold weight of it arrive in her chest. The original maps. The comparison documents Hale had requested to corroborate her survey findings. She had already made copies, had spent 2 days doing it before she filed anything. With the instinct of a surveyor's daughter who had watched her father make duplicates of everything, because originals had a way of disappearing when they were inconvenient. She crossed to her document case. She opened it. She found the folder she was looking for and held it up. "The comparison copies," she said. "I made them before we filed. They're dated and initialed my initials and your brother's." She looked at James. "The originals are gone, but these will hold." James looked at the folder. He looked at her. Something moved through his expression, not relief exactly, but the particular steadiness of a man who had just watched disaster arrive and found that someone had quietly built a wall against it 2 weeks earlier. "You copied them before we filed," he said. "I copy everything," she said. "My father taught me. He said the land remembers, but paper doesn't. So you make 2 copies and you put them in different places." George looked at the folder. Then he looked at Clara with the expression of a man revising something he already thought he knew about a person. "Where's the second?" he said. "Richmond," she said. "With my father's old colleague. I posted them the week before last." The room held the weight of that for a moment. Then James said quietly, "He burned the barn to take the documentation." "He can't have known I made copies," Clara said. "No." James's voice was very flat. "He couldn't have known that." He looked at George. "This changes things. It changes the legal exposure," George said. "Destroying evidence in an active land dispute, that's not a civil matter anymore." "No," James said. "It's not." He picked up his hat. He looked at Clara. Something in his expression had shifted, not toward softness. Exactly, but toward something more open than she had seen from him before. "You protected this," he said, "before you knew you'd need to." "I protect everything I find," she said. "I don't know what's going to matter until it matters." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to the sheriff tonight." "I'll write a statement," she said. "You can take it with you." She sat down at the desk. She began writing. James and George spoke in low voices behind her, making plans, sorting through the shape of what had changed. Her father woke from a doze in his chair, assessed the room's atmosphere, and said, "Someone burned something," with the precision of a man who had spent his life reading what wasn't being said directly. "The north barn," Clara said without stopping her pen. "The maps are gone." Her father was quiet for a moment. "Good thing you made the copies," he said. "Yes," she said. "I taught you that," he said, with a satisfaction so pure it made her eyes sting. "You did," she said. She kept writing. "The sheriff was a lean, Weathered man named Calvin Marsh, who had the reputation of being incorruptible in the specific way that meant he was equally difficult for everyone, which in Hargrove County was apparently considered a virtue. He came to the Whitmore property the next morning, looked at the ruin of the north barn, listened to James's account, read Clara's written statement without expression, and asked 4 questions, each of them precise, each of them aimed at the part of the account where the facts could be verified. When he was done, he said, "Miss Ashworth, the copies you made, are they certified? They bear my initials, dated, and George Whitmore's initials as witness," she said. "And the Richmond copies are in the custody of a retired county surveyor who will provide attestation if required." Marsh looked at her. "Who taught you to document like this?" "My father," she said. Marsh nodded. He looked at his own notes. "Caldwell will say the fire was accidental," he said. "He'll say it," James agreed. "He might even believe it," Marsh said. "But he can't prove that, and I can't prove otherwise. Not without a witness." He paused. "What I can do is make sure the county knows I'm looking. And that tends to cool certain kinds of behavior." He looked at James. "And I can make sure the land office knows the original documents were destroyed during an active dispute, and that certified copies exist. That becomes part of the court record." "That's enough." Hale said he had arrived from town within the hour of hearing to make a formal accusation of evidence tampering. "With the copies as foundation, we proceed as planned. And now there's the additional matter of the barn. Caldwell, it turned out, felt the difference between being disputed and being investigated. The news that Sheriff Marsh had ridden to the Whitmore property and spent an hour asking questions moved through Hargrove County faster than any story Clara had seen travel. And by the following day, the quality of the county's talk had changed. The faction that had been indifferent shifted towards something more attentive. The faction that had been Caldwell's began to make quieter sounds. The Merritts, who had been watching from a careful distance since the supper at Holloway Hall, sent a note expressing that they hoped the matter would be resolved fairly. George read it and said, "The Merritts don't send notes unless they think the wind is changing." The hearing was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks that Clara spent completing the full survey, preparing the final court document with Hale, and managing the daily small erosions that came with being a woman whose name was in the center of a county dispute. The dry goods store grew warmer and then warm again. The Sunday gathering outside the church sorted itself, those who nodded, those who looked away, and a smaller third group who went out of their way to stop and speak to her, each of them in their way making a choice about where they stood. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes was in the third group. Clara had not spoken to her since the Holloway supper, where she had noted her a woman of perhaps 50. Soft-spoken, with the look of someone who watched everything and revealed very little. Eleanor Hayes was widowed, well-respected, and, as Clara had learned through the natural information flow of a small county, had herself been passed over for consideration in ways she had never been allowed to object to directly. She stopped Clara outside the church and said, without preamble, "I read the filing." "The land dispute filing? It's a public record," Eleanor said. "I have a right to read it." She paused. "You documented everything correctly. I know land disputes my husband had, one 20 years ago. He lost it because the documentation was weak." "Thank you," Clara said. "I'm not complimenting you," Eleanor said briskly. "But not unkindly. I'm telling you what's true. There's a difference." She looked at Clara with the direct assessment of a woman who had survived 50 years by reading people accurately. "Caldwell will try to discredit you personally at the hearing. He'll bring the talk. He'll suggest that your position on the Whitmore property makes your testimony interested." "I know," Clara said. "Do you know how to handle it?" Clara looked at her. "Honestly," she said, "the same way I've handled everything. The numbers don't care what people say about the person who measured them." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "That's the right answer," she said. "Make sure you say it exactly like that in the room." She started to go. Then she stopped. Miss Ashworth. The school. There isn't one in this county, a real one. I mean, not just Sunday letters. I've been trying to establish a fund for 3 years. After this is over, she looked at Clara directly. I'd like to speak with you about it. Clara held her gaze. After this is over, she said. Yes, I'd like that. Eleanor nodded once and walked away. Clara stood outside the church and felt something shift inside her, something about the future, which had been gray, uncertain shape for so long that she had stopped looking at it directly. She let herself look at it for a moment, just a moment, before she put it carefully away. The night before the hearing, James came to the cottage. Her father had already gone to bed. The night was warm and close, and she had the window open and the lamp turned low. And she was sitting at the desk, reading through her court document, for the 4th time, not because she thought she had missed anything, but because repetition was her anxiety's only comfort. He knocked. She opened the door. He came in and stood in the sitting room with his hat in his hands, the way he always stood when he came to the cottage. And he looked at her with the expression she had spent weeks learning to read and still hadn't entirely figured out. Sit down, she said. You look like you've been standing in your own thoughts for too long. He almost smiled. He sat. How are you? She asked. He looked at the question as though he was measuring it. Ready, he said, tired of waiting. The waiting is the hardest part, she said. Is it? He looked at her. You don't look like the waiting is hard for you. I work when I wait, she said. It's harder to notice. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the document on the desk. It's solid, he said. The case. It's solid, she agreed. Caldwell is going to say things tomorrow. He paused. About you, I know, I won't be able to, he stopped. His jaw tightened. I won't be able to respond the way I'd like to respond. She looked at him. Something turned over slowly in her chest. The way you'd like to respond, she said carefully. He met her eyes. I don't like it, he said. What he'll say. I don't like that you've had to build armor against it your whole life, and he gets to use it like a weapon in a room full of people. I have good armor, she said. I know you do. He said it with something that was almost frustration, not at her, but at the existence of a world that had required her to build it. That's not the point. She set her pen down. She looked at him fully. James, she said his first name, which she had not used before, which landed in the room with the small weight of a thing being named that had been unnamed. He did not flinch from it. Tomorrow is about the land. Let it be about the land. The documentation is good. The case is sound. What Caldwell says about me will be measured against what I put in front of that room, and what I put in front of that room is accurate and documented and irrefutable. She held his gaze. Let me do my work. He looked at her for a long moment. And after, he said, after. She said, the land will be right. I know it will, he said. I'm asking about something else. The room was very still. Clara held what he had said the way you hold something fragile carefully, aware of its weight. She thought about the paddock fence and the almost smile, and let them and smart man, and all the small accumulated moments of this man, who said things plainly, and only when they meant something. Ask me plainly, she said, after tomorrow. He looked at her. All right, he said. After tomorrow, he stood. He put his hat on. At the door he stopped. Miss Ashworth, he said. Clara, she looked up. For what it's worth, he said. Whatever room you walk into tomorrow, whatever they say. He held her gaze with the full and steady weight of it. I know what you're worth. He said it the way he said everything. Without performance, without decoration, as a simple fact he was depositing into the record. She did not answer immediately. She let it be what it was. Good night, James, she said. He walked out. She turned back to the desk. She put her hand flat on the court document. She felt, beneath her palm, all those pages, the measurements, the dates, the marker positions, the creek line references, the geological anchor points, the whole long, patient record of what was true. She had built it line by line. It was solid. tomorrow. She would walk into that room, and she would let the record speak. The morning of the hearing, Clara's father was already up when she came out of her room. He was sitting at the cottage table with his hands wrapped around a cup and his old surveyor's coat on the one he wore when he meant business. The dark wool one with the brass buttons that her mother had always said made him look like a man who knew what he was about. He had pressed it himself. She could see that. He had pressed it carefully and put it on at 6 in the morning because this was the day his daughter walked into a county hearing room to defend work that carried both their names in its bones. She stopped when she saw him. He looked up. "I'm coming," he said. "Papa, I'm coming, Clara." He said it quietly and absolutely. "Don't argue with me about this." She did not argue. She sat across from him and drank her own cup, and they did not speak much, because they had never needed to fill silence with words. And the silence that morning held everything that mattered: the years of surveys and maps, and following him through fields before she was tall enough to see over the tall grass. The letter she had burned, the wagon to Hargrove, the cottage, the south field, the north boundary, all of it laid out between them in the quiet of early morning, like a map of everything they had built and lost and built again. When it was time, she picked up her document case. Her father stood. He put his hat on. He offered her his arm. She took it. The Hargrove County Land Office hearing room was a plain rectangular space with benches along 3 walls and a long table at the front where the county magistrate, a man named Alderton, sat with Hale on one side and Caldwell's solicitor, a Richmond man named Fitch, well-dressed and practiced, on the other. The room was full. Clara had not expected the room to be full. She had thought of it as a legal proceeding, attended by the parties and their representatives, and perhaps a handful of the curious. But Hargrove was a small county, and the dispute had been the county's primary subject for 3 weeks. And so the benches were packed: the Merritts, the Holloways, including Edmund, Eleanor Hayes in the second row, George Whitmore next to her father at the back, Sheriff Marsh along the far wall, and perhaps 40 others she knew by sight and name and association. James was at the front table beside Hale. He looked at her when she came in. Just one direct look, steady, clear, carrying something she had decided to hold on to. Then he looked back at Magistrate Alderton. She sat at the table and put her document case in front of her and folded her hands on top of it. Fitch, Caldwell's solicitor, looked at her, the way men like him always looked at women like her, with the specific courtesy of someone managing an inconvenience they expect to dissolve. She had seen that look her whole life. She knew exactly what to do with it. The first hour was procedural. Hale presented the filing. Fitch objected to 3 elements of the documentation on technical grounds, each objection precise, each one aimed at finding a seam in the record that might give. Alderton reviewed each one with the careful attention of a man who took his office seriously, and ruled on each of them in turn. 2 of Fitch's objections were sustained on minor points. One was denied. Clara watched and made notes. Then Fitch said, "I'd like to address the competency of the survey document itself." Alderton looked at him. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that the survey was conducted by an individual without formal certification in the Commonwealth of Virginia," Fitch said. He did not look at Clara when he said it. He said it to Alderton. Cleanly, like a man reading from a list of points he had prepared. "Miss Ashworth holds no surveying license. She has no formal professional standing. The documentation, however thorough it may appear, was produced by an uncredentialed individual, and I would submit that the court should weigh that accordingly." The room stirred. Hale was on his feet. The Commonwealth of Virginia does not require a surveying license for a property boundary assessment presented in a civil dispute. The documentation's validity rests on its methodology and accuracy, not on the professional standing of its author. The methodology, Fitch said, was developed by a woman with no formal training, working from memory of her father's professional practice, working from documented methodology. Hale said sharply, cross-referenced against fixed geological points and the original 1798 survey by Thomas Aldridge, who is deceased, Fitch said. Whose work is in the county archive, Hale said, and whose methodology matches Miss Ashworth's findings exactly. Alderton held up his hand. Both men stopped. He looked at Clara, Miss Ashworth. Will you speak to your methodology? She stood. The room was very quiet. She had thought about this moment. She had rehearsed it in the cottage and in the field, and at 3 a.m, with the lamp burning low. She had thought about everything she might say, every defense she might build. She had decided to build nothing. Yes, sir, she said. My methodology follows the standard practice documented in the Aldridge surveys of 1798 and the county assessment protocols of 1804. I measured each marker position against 2 fixed reference points, the creek line along the southern boundary of the property, which has not moved, and 2 granite outcroppings documented in the 1798 survey as permanent geological markers, which also have not moved. She looked at Alderton directly. I did not measure the markers against each other. I measured them against things that cannot lie. The discrepancy I found is 18 inches. Consistent across 6 markers over a quarter-mile run. That degree of consistency over that distance is not an error. It is a pattern. She paused. I will answer any question about my methodology this court wishes to ask. I will also demonstrate the measurements in the field. Today or on any date the court names, in front of any qualified witness the court chooses to send. Aldert looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment. Then he looked at Fitch. Do you have a methodological objection? Or a personnel objection? Fitch adjusted his coat. Both, he said. Then let's hear the methodological one, Alderton said. The personnel one I'll address when we're done. The methodological objection took 40 minutes to dissolve. Fitch had brought his own surveyor, a man named Greer, from Richmond, who took the stand and argued that Clara's reference to the granite outcroppings was unreliable because geological features shift over decades. Hale produced a letter from a Richmond geological scholar, prepared in advance, stating that the specific granite formation in question showed no evidence of movement consistent with the variance claimed. Greer was asked 3 questions he could not answer cleanly. He retreated to qualified language. The room watched. Then Hale called Clara's father. William Ashworth walked to the front of the room with his pressed coat and his brisk buttons and his shaking hands. And he sat down and he spoke for 20 minutes about Thomas Aldridge and the 1798 survey and the northeast corner that had always bothered him and why, and the specific methodology that Aldridge had used and that he had taught to Clara from the time she was 8 years old. He spoke with the precision of a man whose mind had never faltered. Only his body, and every person in that room heard the difference between a man reciting facts and a man bearing witness to truth. When he finished, Fitch had no questions, not because he lacked questions, because every question would have made it worse. Clara watched her father walk back to his seat. She pressed her lips together and looked at her document case and breathed through the fullness in her chest until she was sure of her face. Then Fitch stood and said, I'd like to address the matter of Miss Ashworth's personal situation. The room shifted. James's shoulders tightened. Fitch spoke carefully. He was practiced enough to be careful, but the shape of what he said was unmistakable. He suggested that Clara's position as an unmarried woman living on the Whitmore property, contracted directly to James Whitmore, created an interested relationship that should be considered when weighing her testimony. He did not use crude language. He did not need to. The implication was a thing everyone in the room understood, and some of them leaned into it the way people lean into warmth. The room stirred again, differently this time. Alderton said. Mr. Fitzjames was on his feet. Hale put a hand on his arm. James did not sit down. He stood very still, and the quality of his stillness was the quality of a man exercising profound and deliberate restraint. Mr. Whitmore, Alderton said, I'd like to speak James said. Alderton looked at him for a moment. "This is a legal proceeding, I know what it is," James said. He said it without raising his voice. He said it with the flat, clear weight that Clara had heard from him the night he told Caldwell enough in the Holloway dining room. The same weight, the same complete immovability. "I will say one thing and then sit down." "One sentence." Alderton looked at him for a moment. "One sentence," he said. James looked at the room. He looked at Fitch. Then he looked at Alderton. "Miss Ashworth's contract was offered. She is the most competent person I have encountered in 20 years of managing this land," he said. "And if that requires explanation in this room, then this room needs more education than I can provide today." He sat down. The silence after was the kind that rings. Fitch recovered. He was professional enough to recover. He moved on to his final argument, which was the suggestion that the original boundary markers had been placed by the previous owner of the Whitmore land before James's purchase, and that Caldwell's family had in good faith used the land as bounded by those markers for a decade, and that good faith reliance on established markers constituted a legitimate claim to the boundary as currently positioned. Hale's response took 12 minutes. He referenced the statute. He referenced the deed. He referenced the creek line, the outcroppings, the Aldridge survey, the dating of the marker bases, and the letter from Richmond on the geological stability of the reference points. He put each element in front of Alderton in order, clearly, without dramatics, and when he sat down the argument was as clean as Clara's documentation. Alderton called a recess. The room exhaled. Clara sat at the table and did not move. She was aware of the room around her, conversations starting, people shifting, but she kept her hands flat on the document case and her gaze on the table, and she breathed slowly and waited. Her father appeared at her shoulder. He put his hand on her shoulder briefly and said nothing. She covered his hand with hers. Edmund Holloway was saying something to George Whitmore near the door. Eleanor Hayes was sitting with her hands folded and her face composed in the expression of a woman who has decided what she thinks and is waiting for the room to catch up. James did not come to her during the recess. He stood by the far wall and spoke to Hale in low tones. And she was grateful for it, grateful that he understood, as he seemed always to understand, what she needed and what she didn't. Without requiring her to explain, the recess lasted 20 minutes. When Alderton returned to his chair, the room settled in 15 seconds. Everyone felt it, the weight of what was about to land. Alderton looked at his papers. He looked at the room. He was a deliberate man, not given to theater, and he said what he said in the plain language of a man who had read the documentation and made a decision that the documentation required. The survey evidence presented by Miss Clara Ashworth, cross-referenced against the 1,798 Aldridge survey and the fixed geological reference points along the north boundary of the Whitmore property, is methodologically sound and internally consistent. The marker positions as currently placed do not align with the deed boundaries as established in the original land grant. The discrepancy of 18 inches, consistent across 6 markers over a quarter-mile boundary run, constitutes a material deviation from the recorded property line. He paused. The Hargrove County Land Office will record the corrected boundary as established by the Ashworth survey. Mr. Caldwell's claim to use right based on the erroneous marker positions is not sustained. The north boundary of the Whitmore property is restored to its deed-established location. He set the papers down. He looked at Clara. The documentation in this case is among the most thorough I have seen presented in a county boundary dispute, he said. The court notes that for the record. Fitch was already gathering his papers. Caldwell, who had been in the back of the room, was on his feet and through the door before Alderton finished speaking. The room did not explode. It exhaled a long collective release of something held, and then it began to move. Conversation starting and rising, and in the middle of it Clara sat very still with her hands on her document case and let the weight of what had just happened find its level in her chest. Her father said, quietly, beside her, "Your mother would have," and stopped. "I know," Clara said. He pressed his lips together. He nodded once. She stood. The room rearranged itself around her in the way rooms rearrange when the thing everyone was watching has been decided. People came to speak to James. People came to speak to Hale. Edmund Holloway crossed the room and shook James's hand and said something she didn't hear. The Merritts were talking with George. Eleanor Hayes came directly to Clara. She crossed the room, without circling, without the social maneuvering that other people use to position themselves relative to the newly vindicated. And she stopped in front of Clara and said, "Well done. The documentation did the work," Clara said. "You did the documentation," Eleanor said flatly. "Don't give the paper credit for what you built." She paused. "The school fund. I meant what I said. When you're ready." "I'm ready now," Clara said. Eleanor looked at her. A brief, assessing look. Then something in her face warmed by a degree. "Monday," she said. "My house. Bring your notebook." She walked away. Clara turned and found James directly behind her. She had not heard him cross the room. He was simply there, the way he was always simply there, not performing his arrival. Not announcing it, just present in the full undecorated way that was particular to him. He looked at her, she looked at him. "The record speaks," he said. It was what she had said the night before the hearing. He had heard it and held it and given it back to her now. In this moment, and the fact that he remembered, that he carried the small things she said with the weight he gave the large ones hit her somewhere below the level of thought. "Yes," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You told me to ask you after." She waited. "After," he said, "is now." The room was loud around them. People were still moving, still talking, the way people do when a county dispute has resolved, and there are opinions to share and relationships to navigate. None of it touched the 2 feet of air between Clara and James Whitmore. "Ask me," she said. He looked at her with the same directness he had given her from the first, the look that didn't take inventory. Didn't assess her value against some external standard. Just looked at her, the full person of her, and found that sufficient and more. "I'm not asking you to stay because of the survey," he said. "The survey is done. The contract will be honored in full and you'll have everything it promised." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay because the Whitmore land makes sense when you're on it. Because your father looks like himself again when he talks about the northeast corner. Because I have been a better version of what I'm trying to be. Since the morning you told me my foreman was wrong." He stopped. He looked at his hat in his hands, then back at her. "And because I'd like to spend the rest of my life as the man who is known for having had the sense to choose you." The room kept moving around them. Clara stood in the middle of it. She thought about the letter she had burned. She thought about the wagon to Hargrove and Edmund's smile and Harriet Caldwell's compassion. She thought about the East Field and the almost smile, and Let Them and Smart Man and her father pressing his coat at 6 in the morning with brass buttons, and the South Field and the North Boundary and 14 pages that said what was true. She thought about choosing from strength and not from desperation. About waiting for the thing that was worth waiting for. She looked at James Whitmore, who was not eloquent and not decorative and not easy. Who said what he meant and meant what he said and had not once, in all the weeks she had known him, asked her to be less than she was. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not staying because the arrangement is convenient." "I know that too," he said. "I'm staying," she said, "because you're the only person I've met who treats truth the way I do. Like it matters more than comfort." She held his gaze. "And because I would like to know what it is to be chosen by a man who chose me before he understood what I was worth." He looked at her. "I knew what you were worth," he said. "From the East Field. The drainage problem," she said. "The way you said it," he said. "Like it was simply true and you were simply telling me. No performance, no apology." He paused. "I haven't met many people who do that. She reached out and touched the back of his hand briefly. Lightly, the way you touch something to verify it is real. He turned his hand and covered hers. The room continued around them, loud and full, and entirely unaware that anything significant was happening in this particular corner of it. That was fine. Some things did not require an audience. They were married that October. When the survey was fully filed and the boundary had been formally corrected and the 11 acres of North Ridge timber had been counted and assessed and logged into the Whitmore records in Clara's precise hand. It was not a large wedding. It was not designed for spectacle. Her father walked her in with both hands steady for the first time in years. He had been working with James's hired hands in the mornings, nothing strenuous. Nothing that asked his hands to hold a transit, but productive, purposeful work that gave him something to look at, besides the memory of what he used to be able to do. He had found what he still could do, and it had put the light back in his eyes. Eleanor Hayes sat in the front row. She had spent the week since the hearing turning a fund into a plan and a plan into a building location. And she had told Clara on Monday morning at her kitchen table that the county school would be open by spring and that she intended Clara to teach the surveying and land mathematics curriculum because there was, in her opinion, no one in the county better qualified. Clara had said yes before Eleanor finished the sentence. George Whitmore cried, which surprised everyone, including himself. He recovered quickly and attributed it to dust, which no one believed. Sheriff Marsh attended and stood in the back. He had come, he said, because he liked a county story that ended right. Edmund Holloway sent a gift, a fine set of drafting instruments in a leather case, the kind used for technical drawings, with a note that said simply, "For the work and for the person doing it." E.H. Clara kept the instruments. She thought he had, after all, grown into something better than what he'd been. Caldwell did not attend. Caldwell had retreated into the particular silence of a man who has been publicly wrong and cannot recover his standing by force, which was the hardest kind of silence for men like him. He would manage eventually. People like Caldwell always did. But the 11 acres were Whitmore land, the boundary was recorded, and the documentation that had established both lived in the county archive in Clara's name. That would outlast Caldwell's silence. That would outlast most things. On the evening after the wedding, when the guests were gone and her father was asleep in the cottage, and the main house was quiet in the way only a house full of decision feels quiet, Clara sat at the desk in what was now her study, the room James had cleared for her specifically, with north-facing light and enough wall space for survey maps, and opened a fresh notebook. She wrote the date at the top of the first page. She wrote, Whitmore Valley, full assessment, year 2. James appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame and looked at her, with the look she had spent months learning and never quite finished. The look that held more than it showed, and showed enough. Working, he said. It was not a question. Starting, she said. The North Timber assessment needs to be done before winter. And I want to look at the creek gradient on the eastern boundary. I think there's a third drainage issue we haven't found yet. Of course there is, he said. She looked up. Is that a complaint? No, he said. It's an appreciation. He looked at the notebook. You're going to find everything this land is hiding. Aren't you? That's what I do, she said. He came to the desk. He stood behind her and looked at the blank pages ahead of her. All that white space waiting for the truth she would put into it. All that land waiting to be read and recorded and understood. He put his hand on her shoulder, steady, unhurried. The way he did everything. Good, he said. She put her hand over his. Outside, the October dark had settled over Whitmore Valley, and the land lay quiet under it, all those acres. The South Field and the North Ridge and the creek line and the corrected boundary and the 11 acres of timber that had always been Whitmore land and were now recorded as such. All of it exactly what it had always been, waiting only for someone honest enough to see it clearly and brave enough to say so. Clara Ashworth Whitmore had spent her whole life being that person in rooms that did not want her. She had burned a letter and ridden a wagon into a county that saw her as provision. And she had walked out of that county on her own terms, with her work in her hands and her name on the record. She had not been saved. She had not been rescued. She had not been handed a life by someone with the power to give it. She had built it, line by line, measurement by measurement, truth by truth. And now the land was right and the record was sound. And the man behind her knew exactly who she was and had chosen her anyway, not despite it. But for it, the whole of it, every capable and unbending and honest inch. That was not provision. That was something a woman chose for herself. And Clara Whitmore had chosen it from the only position that mattered, not from desperation. Not from gratitude, not from a lack of anywhere else to go, but from the full, clear-eyed, undefeated strength of a woman who had always known her own worth and had simply waited for a world large enough to deserve it.